It takes money, and lots of it, to get into office in the United States. As the U.S. election wraps up, both the Republican and Democratic campaigns will have spent almost a combined total of $2 billion. Do these donations come with any expectations, or are they merely an expression of free speech? To help us answer that question, we're joined in Cambridge, Massachusetts, by Lawrence Lessig. He's the Harvard Law professor and author of Republic Lost: How Money Corrupts Congress and a Plan to Put a Stop to It. And Professor Lessig, it's good to have you on the line. Welcome back to the program.
Great to be here.
Let's just start with the title. How come you called it Republic Lost as opposed to Democracy Lost?
Well, I think that our framers gave us what they thought of as a republic, which is something different from a direct democracy, something different from what they thought of as democracy at the time. It was a representative democracy. But the critical dynamic was that the system was to have a branch, Congress, that, as they put it, would be dependent upon the people alone. But of course, what we've evolved is a branch of government which is not just dependent upon the people, but is increasingly dependent upon funders of their campaigns. And those funders are not the people. They don't represent the people. They're a tiny fraction of the people. And they are, I think, the dynamic that makes the system corrupt.
And you're really prepared to say that the republic is lost as opposed to just sort of in trouble?
Well, this feature that a republic would be a representative democracy dependent upon the people alone is lost. And part of the argument of the book is just describing how incredibly hard it would be to get it back, because so much of what goes on inside the Beltway in Washington depends upon the system functioning exactly the way it functions now. As Jim Cooper puts it, a Democrat from Tennessee, Capitol Hill has become a kind of farm league for K Street where the lobbyists work, because so many of these people think about their future as a future working as lobbyists. And of course, the lobbying system is so lucrative because they play an essential role in how we fund campaigns. So in this sense, there's an incredible burden, a incredible hurdle to get over if, in fact, we're going to find a way to make the system responsive again to the people alone.
And yet you tell us a century ago your country was in a very similar set of circumstances. Explain that, if you would.
Yeah, so a century ago, the United States faced a similar problem with corruption, although it was a different kind of corruption. It was old-fashioned corruption, the kind of bribery, quid pro quo corruption, the stuff that was plainly illegal, yet was practiced by people at all levels of government. And in my view, at least at the federal level, we've eliminated that kind of corruption. So when I talk about a corrupt system, I don't allege that anybody is committing any criminal act, anybody's violating any rule, any law. In fact, I think they're very meticulous to make sure that they don't break the law. They kind of believe that they live within the system somehow, what they're doing is virtuous or good. But in fact, you can have people behaving legally, but the system itself has become corrupted. And that's the kind of corruption that I'm talking about. And it might actually be more difficult to attack this because, unlike the old kind of corruption, there's nobody you can point to and say, this person's violating the law.
Well, here's a quote from the book. Quote, "Practically every important issue in American politics today is tied to this one issue of campaign finance." How so?
Well, you pick your issue. It can be from the left or the right. So people on the right want to build a simpler tax system. But of course, what I argue in the book, and many people have commented before, the complexity of the tax system is tied up intimately with the need for congressmen to have a simple way to raise money. So you have a special tax benefit, then the people who benefit from that tax benefit have a direct tie, a direct reason to try to continue that tax benefit. So if you want to simplify the tax system, what you're up against is not just a theory of whether some version of a tax system is better than another. You're also up against the fact that to change the tax system and make it simpler is to make it harder for members of Congress to raise money. Or think about global warming. It is impossible, I think, for this Congress, even the Democratic Party in this Congress, to ever pass any comprehensive, sensible response to the problem of global warming, just because the power of coal companies and oil companies in the funding of campaigns is so significant that they could blackmail either party into avoiding any such fundamental reform. So pick your issue. When you see the way in which Congress can't address that issue sensibly, then the reason they can't address it sensibly, I think, ties ultimately to the ability of a relatively small group of people to veto sensible policy in the name of preserving the status quo.
Well, let's go back to the height of Watergate, 1974, and if my statistics are correct here, the total amount of money spent in all the House and Senate races was $77 million. We now, of course, know that each of the Republicans and Democrats are going to spend $1 billion in this run for president. What effect do you think having to raise all this money has on the priorities of an elected official?
Yeah, so you've made the important distinction most people gloss over. First of all, it's important to remember it's $2 billion for the presidential campaigns, but the estimates now are that we're going to spend $6 billion in this election cycle. Now, people say that's so much money, and my own view is I don't know how much money we ought to be spending. I mean, it's how would you know how much to spend? That's probably about as much as we spend advertising soap in the United States. So between soap and the president, it's not, or political offices, it's not implausible that we should be spending this amount of money. But as you just emphasized, the critical point is not the money, it's how the money is raised. So if you're a member of Congress and you're spending 30 to 70% of your time raising money, 2 to 3 to 4 hours on the phone every day, every single night at some different cocktail party or some different fundraiser, that experience, that life experience affects you. It makes you extremely sensitive to what your funders want. But the funders are not everybody. The funders are not the people. The funders are the tiniest slice of the 1%. I think the relevant number is something like 0.05% of America is funding the most important chunk of presidential and congressional campaigns. So in that life of raising money from the tiniest slice of the 1%, it can't help but be the case that members become sensitive to their issues and not sufficiently sensitive to the issues of everybody else. Now, in the presidential level, we forget that until Barack Obama, every election since Richard Nixon has been a publicly funded presidential election, a system that benefited Republicans and Democrats alike. Indeed, the single largest beneficiary was Ronald Reagan, who ran 3 times with public money to become president of the United States. But when Ronald Reagan ran in 1984, he conducted 0 fundraisers. He spent 0 time raising money for his campaign because that's what the public funding system gave him without requiring him to raise that money, which meant that he could spend time talking to voters or more engaged in the actual process of convincing people to vote for him rather than convincing the tiniest slice of America to fund him in his run for president.
But evidently in their wisdom, they've decided they need more money than what public funding can provide for, and they're getting way more by doing it on their own, right?
That's right. Rather than addressing, I think the problems that that exist with the existing public funding system are many, and they needed to be addressed. And there's lots of important reforms that we could put in place. But rather than taking on that hard problem, I think what's happened is we've taken the short-sighted solution, which is to rely upon private funding, and that private funding system at the presidential level and at the congressional level has produced a system where members are too sensitive, on the left and the right, too sensitive to the concerns of a tiny slice of us and not to the concerns of all of us.
Let me read something that was in an edition of Mother Jones magazine about a year and a half ago, and it goes like this. Income inequality has grown dramatically since the mid-70s, far more in the U.S. than in most advanced countries, and the gap is only partly related to college grads outperforming high school grads. Rather, the bulk of our growing inequality has been a product of skyrocketing incomes among the richest 1% and even more dramatically among the top 0.1%. It has, in other words, been CEOs and Wall Street traders at the very tippy top who are hoovering up vast sums of money from everyone, even those who by ordinary standards are pretty well off. And I'm wondering whether you see any connection between this rise in inequality and the growth of campaign spending.
Yeah, so this analysis is repeated in a really fantastic book called The Winner-Take-All Society, or Winner-Take-All Politics, sorry. And in that book, the authors, first of all, make this point that we've basically moved to a society where we see increasing inequality with the very, very top, the fraction of the 1%, doing much, much better than everybody else. But the second point that they make in this book, which I think is the critical money point, is that one of the most important reasons for the increase in this inequality is changes in government policy. So the government itself is being lobbied to change policy to make it easier for some to do extremely well while the rest of us don't do extremely well. And I think that's directly tied, although the authors of this book don't make this point directly, but I think this is directly tied to the extraordinary explosion in campaign finance. I mean, just look at Wall Street. You saw in the 1990s, Democrats and Republicans alike fiercely competitive to try to raise as much money as they could from Wall Street, each of them singing the songs of deregulation and maintaining the special tax rate for hedge fund managers, eager to use these policy tools to facilitate the most that they could raise for their campaigns. And the consequence of that, of course, is government policy, which helps exacerbate the problem of income inequality. So it is tied, I think, directly to the way the government makes its decisions, and the way the government makes its decision, I think, is directly tied to the way that we fund campaigns.
Okay, Lawrence Lessig, stand by for 1 second because we want to broaden our discussion now. So we're joined in New York City via Skype by Matt Welch. He's editor-in-chief at Reason Magazine. And Matt, you've heard our last interview, and I wonder if you'd just care to pick up on a point and give us your first response.
It's very interesting, I think, that Professor Lessig talks about, like, what is the actual price? What is the appropriate amount of spending? We don't know. And it's not a huge amount compared to other things. This is not, I don't think, how corporations make their money, by spending money on political candidates. They spend way much more money on lobbying than they do on direct money to candidates. And it's also recently, in the last 5-10 years, has become a way for people who aren't rich to affect the system. I mean, Ron Paul, Barack Obama, these people were able to pool the resources of little people. Unions are corporations. They pool resources of people who aren't generally the super rich, and they heavily influence politics in places like my native state of California. And so from my standpoint, which is admittedly a libertarian standpoint, then you ask, okay, what can we do to limit the distorting, the warping effects on policy and behavior for this? And it seems to me that lying at the root of some of this, at least, is that the size of the federal government doubled nominally from 2000 to 2010 and went from $1.8 trillion to $3.6 trillion in spending. As you do more in government, people have more of an interest to try to affect what you do. It's just kind of obvious. As you write more regulation, and this past administration with the Obamacare and Dodd-Frank, they've passed legislation that creates entire mountains of, well, we're going to write the regulation later. So, of course, everyone with a vested stake in that, the industries with a vested stake, and then also activist groups with a vested stake, are going to spend money on lobbyists and also on campaigns to try to affect this conversation. So if you shrink the scope that the government can have in the decisions that we make and the things that we do, then you will begin to shrink the scope of this warping thing. If we had no agricultural subsidies, we went full New Zealand here and said no more subsidies, then you wouldn't have Archer Daniels Midland showering so much money, then you wouldn't have ethanol politics in Iowa.
Okay, so, Matt, let me stop you there for a second.
Uh-huh.
You've given us about 5 or 6 different things to unpack there, but I'd like Lawrence maybe to pick up on the last one there. Do you think Matt makes a good case when he says if government weren't so big, the requirement to grease the wheels of different lobbying groups with so much money, you'd take that rationale away? What do you say to that?
Well, I agree with him. If the government weren't so big, then there wouldn't be such a big opportunity for the government to extort money out of people who have it, to force them to contribute to campaigns the way the system currently does. But you can't just assume away the hardest problem. How do you get to a smaller government? Because the only way we're going to get a smaller government is if Congress votes for it. And if Congress has a vested interest in a larger government, because it makes it easier for them to raise money, or it makes it easier for them to extort money because they've got complicated regulations or they've complicated ways in which people depend upon the government, then we're not going to see a smaller government so long as we fund campaigns the way we fund campaigns. And the point that I was making, of course, said nothing about censoring anybody's speech. Mm-hmm. I agree with him. I think Citizens United, on the facts, the question whether that nonprofit filmmaker should have been free to use corporate funds to promote the film was rightly decided. I think it's absolutely true. They should have been free to use their funds to promote their own film. The question isn't whether McCain-Feingold or the remedies of the past 40 years make sense, all basically censorship remedies. I agree, they don't make sense. What I'm talking about is trying to build a different way to fund campaigns so that we don't have such extraordinary power concentrated in a small number of people that then gets leveraged in exactly the way Matt's talking about, through lobbying and campaign contributions. These are complementary to be used to direct government policy in a way that truly does provide enormous benefit back to the corporations that are buying it, and benefit to the congressmen that need to raise the campaign cash. The only people who lose in the transaction are the rest of us who pay the consequences of these stupid government policies.
Matt, let me get you to follow up, since we've mentioned Citizens United a few times here. For those who don't know, it was a Supreme Court decision which in effect said that money should be considered speech. You have free speech in the United States, therefore if you have unlimited money to speak, you can spend unlimited amounts to speak. Let's follow up on that, Matt. Do you agree that money should be considered speech and therefore flow freely?
I believe that people organized in corporations should be able to spend their money broadcasting their messages without interference from the government. I think that's probably the simplest way to put it. Is the New York Times a person? No, it's a newspaper and it publishes stuff, and it should be able to. And I think the same is true for people who want to pool their money together, including people who want to pool their money together to try to run ads that oust incumbents and try to fight in the direction towards limiting the size of government. I mean, some of the super PACs that have arisen as a result of Citizens United are ones that are pushing in directions that Professor Lessig's talking about. Actually, not all of them, certainly, probably not the majority of them. But it's interesting to think about it, because I think that the way that we tend to imagine a lot of this money sloshing around is that it's done by fat cats to kind of twist things in their directions. And that happens, there is no doubt. But let's also think about more direct ways in which an interested party can spend money to do things. Writing an initiative, for example, in the states that allow it, mostly in the West Coast or the western part of the United States, that's how you really start something up. And that's a process by which actually you can root around politics. We have on the ballot in November 3 different drug legalization, marijuana legalization initiatives in Colorado and Washington and Oregon. You're never going to go anywhere giving money to politicians to try to affect this particular problem. But if you want to, you can spend a lot of money to try to write a law and get it enshrined. So I think it's interesting to note that it is possible to actually change some of these bad effects of money in politics by spending money in politics. It's just a complicated kind of mixed up world out there, and so I am eager for solutions. I mean, Professor Lessig's idea about let's give a voucher, a $50 voucher, or whatever his number is these days, on it for people to spend on candidates is a very interesting policy and worth talking about. I wonder if in practicality you're going to end up having what you have now, which is that the people who are passionate about politics, either just through conviction or who feel like they have skin in the game and need to protect it, are going to end up, as they do now, dominating that process.
Let me just jump in there, because I think we need a little explanation of that. Lawrence, can you tell us what that voucher system that has just been described, what effect that would actually have on things?
Yeah, well, so the idea is to try to create a system where we no longer have the tiniest fraction of the 1% funding, but more of us could be participating in funding. So let's take the first $50 that all of us pay in taxes, and every single voter pays at least $50 to the federal treasury in taxes. Take that first $50 and rebate it in the form of a democracy voucher. And with that voucher, you can give all of it or a part of it to any congressional candidate who agrees to fund his or her campaign with vouchers only and contributions up to, let's say, about $100. Now, $50 a voter is $7 billion. And $7 billion is about 3 times the total amount raised and spent in 2010. So this is real money. But unlike the current system, it's money that comes from all of us. So when candidates are dependent upon their funders, they're also dependent upon the people. And that, I think, is the essential change that we have to have in order to end the kind of corruption that we've got in the system right now, where they're dependent upon a tiny, tiny fraction of us. And so that's the way in which you could use speech to kind of to compensate for the corruption the system has evolved.
All right, but a follow-up here. If the court has decided that speech is that money is speech, even though you've put a very high ceiling on the speech here, you're still limiting money, therefore limiting speech. Is this problematic then?
Well, no, actually, under the court's jurisprudence, what I've just described is completely constitutional, because I don't have any objection to the idea of money as speech. And the court has never said that a candidate doesn't have the freedom to decide to limit his or her contributions to whatever number they want. So a candidate can say, fine, I voluntarily opt into a system where nobody could believe money is buying results with me because the contributions are $50 vouchers and $100 checks. That's the most it could be. So candidates, politicians need to have the constitutional right to stand by a set of principles that makes it possible for us to believe in them. It would really be a perverse system if we forced people to live in a system where we can't help but believe that it's the big dollars that are buying their particular allegiance.
Matt, you're okay with this idea?
I congratulate Professor Lessig for coming up with one of the few, I think, campaign finance reform ideas that don't curtail anybody's freedom, as far as I can tell. I would want to make sure that it wasn't automatically rebated to everybody, or sort of kind of coerce. You have to spend your democracy voucher. Maybe you don't want to. I would guess the majority of people wouldn't necessarily want to. But beyond that, I think it's interesting. I think the question policy-wise, and I don't have an answer, I'm just asking out loud, is are we just setting up another kind of like post-Watergate system where there are limits and it works for a couple of election cycles and then we zoom through it? And does it in fact actually contribute to raising the price of elections because there's this guaranteed money pot out there in the way that we sort of increase college tuition by subsidizing it? But those are just, trial balloons. My objections to things generally are you taking my freedom? Are you stepping on my toes? This doesn't. It's creative. I think it's definitely what we're talking about. Okay,
well, one follow-up here, Matt. When a citizen looks at the amount of money involved in the current campaign, and Lawrence has just told us in the previous segment, congressional races, presidential races, Senate races, we're looking at $6 billion. Does this not create an aura of, if not uncertainty, then maybe as far as, well, let's go so as far as to say distrust or corruption in the political system?
I'm not sure. I mean, I say that honestly. I'm really not sure. Campaign finance reform has been talked about, or the money in politics has been talked about as an issue, particularly among journalists and academics and some politicians like John McCain for a really long time. I don't think it's ever really been a burning issue among voters, even when I was one of them who felt it was much more of a burning issue than I do now. I think there's a general overall feeling that Congress isn't particularly useful, although people tend to like their own congressperson more than they like Congress writ large. And there's probably a sense of that, some of this has to do that they're out of touch. Many of them are rich, they're all lawyers, they are going to fundraisers nonstop and these kind of things. It contributes to it. I'm not sure how much we need to craft public policy solutions around the perceived cynicism of citizens.
Lawrence Lessig, let me give you the last 30 seconds to wrap it up.
Yeah, so in fact, in July, Gallup poll asked the number one issue, or the top issues the next president should address. Number two on that list was corruption in Washington, by which they don't mean Jack Abramoff corruption, because we've forgotten Jack Abramoff corruption. What they were talking about was this corruption in the way that we're actually funding these campaigns. So for the people, this is an important issue. But of course, neither Obama nor Romney even mentions the issue on their website, because too embarrassing is it to address this ugly elephant sitting in the middle of the room.
Okay. That's the author of Republic Lost, How Money Corrupts Congress and a Plan to Stop It, Lawrence Lessig in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and the editor-in-chief of Reason Magazine, Matt Welch, in New York City via Skype. Thanks to both of you for your contribution to our program tonight. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.